Brilliant. So yeah, I'm going to have a chat with you about the hedgerow management cycle primarily, and I suppose that's a big part of the hedgerow management guidelines that we developed alongside Fingal. So these two photographs here just show some pictures from, this one here is from a survey that Project Fogarty did of some of the towns in Fingal in a couple of years back. So this is from Scaries, where I joined alongside him. And then this is a photograph of a hedge laying training day in Balbriggan that some of the local community groups took part in. So just to put it into context, I know it's already been discussed, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but the value of hedgerows really from a biodiversity point of view and why it's such a big part of the Tidy Towns competition is really important. These are just some photographs of some hedgerow trees, common hedgerow trees that provide lots of berries in the autumn time. So this here we have spindle. It's a lovely, beautiful tree that I don't think is as common as hawthorn in hedgerows, but it's a great one to add in for extra diversity if you're looking to kind of mix things up a little bit. Then we have the haws, the hawthorn berries that we'd be familiar with. Over here we have kind of Gelder rose, these beautiful vibrant red berries that come out, and then the hazelnuts as well on the hazel trees. So hazel is a great tree to incorporate into your hedgerows, particularly in like kind of suburban areas. They grow very well, and they don't have thorns as well. So if you're looking for an alternative to one with thorns, hazel is a great one. This is a lovely diagram from the pollinator plan showing how these hedgerows transition through the seasons. So similar to the diagram you shared of the flowering plants, it just highlights how having a diversity of plants within the hedgerow when you're planting is really important, and how species like bramble, which aren't a core part of the hedgerow trees, but are often found alongside hedgerows or in them, are also part of this cycle. And particularly the ivy as well. So ivy would generally, in some cases, can indicate maybe poor hedgerow condition in the sense that oftentimes neglected hedgerows or ones that have been overmanaged tend to have quite a lot of ivy, because the ivy, I suppose, thrives more so, when the hedgerow tree itself is being kind of pushed down and is being a bit neglected. The ivy thrives, so you'll often see ivy in kind of more neglected hedgerows. But it is a beautiful plant and really important for bees, particularly in the autumn and winter time. So this diagram is from pollinators.ie, and you can have a closer look at it on their website. And this is a great diagram from the People's Trust for Endangered Species over in the UK, which shows some of the other benefits. So apart from biodiversity, the reason why I suppose Fingal County Council is trying to encourage nature-friendly hedgerow management is because of all of these other benefits. So I suppose on a farmland scale, and there is quite a lot of farming in Fingal as well, it offers soil protection, shelter for livestock, crop protection too from wind. But also in a suburban context, this is important for ourselves too. So imagine an open park, where children are playing right beside maybe a busy road. If there's a hedgerow or tree line planted between them and the road, it similarly, protects them from the maybe noise and air pollution of the adjacent traffic. And also maybe from the wind if it's a really windy day and they're playing a match. So some of these benefits, translate from farmland to suburban areas too. And then these are some of the other ones that have been discussed. So the wildlife and pollinators have been chatted about. The shade also applicable in suburban areas, particularly on a hot day. Like if children are playing in the summer, the hedgerows can offer a lot of shade protection. And they can also help with flood control and kind of slowing down the runoff of water from the landscape. So they can play a big role in management of water in the landscape as well. And in terms of what a healthy hedgerow should look like to provide all of these benefits, I suppose an ornamental hedge that is being clipped multiple times a year to 1 metre or less is not going to provide these benefits to the same extent as a beautiful, nature-friendly kind of managed hedgerow. And there's different components. So we have hedgerow trees, so the taller hedgerows that are allowed to flower and come into fruit as well. The kind of shrubby growth that maybe is cut more regularly, whereas the hedgerow trees might not be cut at all. The hedge margin as well, so managed in very much the same way as a wildflower meadow would be. So one easy way to increase the nature value of your existing hedgerows is to allow a margin of a couple of metres to grow alongside it. And also ditches or drains can be a very important part. So in a lot of older hedgerows in Ireland, They would have been planted maybe on banks when the soil was taken out of the drain to create a ditch put onside the bank, and the trees were planted alongside it. But you might see this along roadside or as part of the Tidy Towns competition on approach roads in particular. So actually those drains and the water quality in those drains can play a big role in the biodiversity factor. So for the next 10 minutes, what I'm going to focus on, I thought in my time, is something that is maybe more complicated and that's a little bit harder to wrap your head around, and so it can help to have that explained. So this is the hedgerow management cycle, and it's also, this diagram is created by the People's Trust for Endangered Species, but it was initially kind of arose from a work done by Nigel Adams from the UK. He's a great hedgerow expert. And what this shows is how hedgerows move throughout their lives. So a hedgerow is not a static habitat, as any habitat is not static. It's changing all the time, and kind of trying to keep them trimmed and maintained the same year on year is not going to work, because a hedgerow is something that has been planted by humans, and we're containing those trees in a way that's unnatural to them. A tree wants to grow, and if we're managing them in a way that it's a dense hedgerow, that's sort of taking away what's natural to the tree and imposing the benefits that we want from them, a dense boundary or a dense habitat or wildlife corridor. And so in order to keep them in, kind of providing those benefits, we need to allow them to somewhat move through their natural life cycle, to help them retain those benefits. And I'll explain, kind of go through these different ones, because this graph looks a bit complicated when you first look at it. But I'll break it down in these next few slides. And these slides will, I think, be emailed out as well to attendees, so you can have a look at them. So this diagram kind of divided hedgerows into different types of condition. And these are ranked in this kind of diagram from kind of H1 to I think H10. And this one here, H1, shows kind of a red one. So this is like a traffic light system, red, amber, and green. So this one shows one in red condition. This is something that we might typically see around Ireland. So hedgerows that have been heavily trimmed at the same point for years and years, to the point of, I suppose, some of the trees dying off in between those remnant leftover trees. And you'll see the hard knuckle. So Catherine Keenan Chagas likes to call that like the toilet brush hedge. You'll see a hard knuckle of dense growth kind of at the point where it's been cut year on year. Because a lot of these plants, when you cut them, there's new growth that comes from wherever you cut them. And so if you cut them at the same point every year, there's going to be more and more growth trying to come from that point where you've been cutting it. And eventually that'll form a hard knuckle that reduces the health of the hedge in the long term. So at this point, if a hedge is in this condition, there's not that many management options that will allow it to be a dense hedgerow. The only thing that will return it to being a dense hedgerow really would be, say, coppicing and replanting. So coppicing is where it's literally cut off at the stem and allowed to regrow from the base, and new whips are planted in between the leftover trees. So it's quite an invasive, not the same in invasive species, but it's quite a dramatic management option. And so we want to prevent hedgerows from reaching this point. But also there's an argument that if a hedgerow is in this point, perhaps it's better to just, leave it, and it has biodiversity value of its own in the wildflower areas, maybe in between the trees. But if you are looking to return it to a dense hedgerow, coppicing would be the only option, really. At this point, coppicing is also the only option, even though there's still a few stems in between. They're not at a frequency where they can be laid, and I'll touch on laying it shortly. So it's similarly over-trimmed. There's a hard knuckle where it's been trimmed every single year, and the stems are quite infrequent. So there's lots of gappiness in the hedge, and they're often quite low as well. And you might not see as much diversity as well in the kind of the ground flora, because if a hedgerow, I suppose, has been managed in this way for a long, long time, the likelihood is that the adjacent hedge margin will have been heavily managed as well. So at this point, coppicing and replanting is also the only option. Hedge laying is not an option at this point. This is a more of an amber now. So those were the two kind of red hedgerow conditions, I suppose. And here is a great place for intervention. So if you have a hedgerow that it has a good frequency of stems, so stems like every half metre to a metre even, but ideally every half metre, that has a hard knuckle forming, but it still has a good amount of stems, this is the ideal place to intervene and to do something about it, because this hedgerow hasn't gone into the red yet. So at this point, hedge laying is still an option, which is less dramatic. It's less impactful on biodiversity. And what you would do here, I suppose, if you have a hedgerow in this condition, is try to bring it into that rejuvenation cycle with hedge laying, where you let this grow for a couple of years, as tall as you can, I suppose, maybe 2 or 3 years, and then you would bring it into the hedge laying cycle. And I'll talk about hedge laying shortly. So if you have a hedgerow that looks a little bit like this, where there's a good frequency of stems, the knuckle is starting to form, but it's not quite as gappy yet, this is a great place to intervene and prioritise, I suppose, hedgerows like this before they reach the red. And then this is the green. So if you bring it into that rejuvenation cycle, let it grow and bring it into the rejuvenation cycle, you'll end up with something like this. So this is a graphic kind of showing hedge laying. I have more real life pictures afterwards. But this score 4 is a hedgerow that has been recently rejuvenated, either through laying or coppicing. As you can see here, coppicing is a lot more dramatic because the tree is cut all the way down to the ground and let to regrow. And also recently planted hedgerows would fall under this category of score 4. So really what it's showing is that there's new growth coming. There's new growth coming from the base here where it has been laid, and there's new growth coming from where it has been coppiced, or there's new growth obviously coming from where you've just planted a new tree. And so this is the start of the green cycle. And I'm not going to kind of talk a lot about planting at the moment, because planting can often be maybe something that is more easily understood. So I'm going to chat about kind of more like the rejuvenation, like hedge laying, that's a bit more complex. So if those recently laid, coppiced or planted hedgerows are just kind of allowed to grow, for a while, not trimmed, eventually they might they'll reach score 5, which is sort of like a dense hedgerow, maybe 1.5 meters tall, looks quite healthy, about the height of a person, and has those frequent healthy stems. So frequent healthy stems that are not dying. And at this point, they can go into routine management. So routine management just means trimming. So trimming and cutting hedgerows is part of the cycle. It's not a bad thing. It's just how it's done. So incrementally trimming, so lightly trimming it year on year, or else bringing it into the rotational trimming where you trim certain sections every year and leave other sections to grow tall for the hawthorn flowers. So when you bring it into that routine management, it's allowed to kind of gradually grow up and up and up. So routine management doesn't mean you're keeping it like that forever. The idea is you're gradually increasing the height of the hedge, and then eventually it'll grow a little bit taller, a bit more scraggly. At this point, you can either keep just doing the trimming and allow it to grow even taller, or you could, start laying it maybe, but ideally you'd let it increase for another kind of year or two. There's an option here in the PTS cycle of saying like a non-intervention hedgerow, where it's just let to grow and then, recut with a circular saw. But in the context of suburban areas, kind of keeping it in the cycle is a little bit better. So if it's allowed to grow taller, you see it's still in the green, and at this point, it's kind of perfect for laying. So it's perfect to bring it back into that rejuvenation cycle, so score 4. You remember the 3 pictures? Yeah, so you want to bring it back to that point. So you're not keeping it here, you're bringing it back to that point. So it's circling through the green scores. It's not staying in one score, it's circling through the green scores and not being allowed to move into the amber or the red. At this point, it's quite tall, it looks a bit scraggly, and this is when it's perfect for laying before the stems grow too tall. If it's allowed to grow too tall, it'll eventually reach a height where it's too leggy. It's much more difficult to lay, I suppose, with hand tools. It becomes a much more professional job, and it might start getting a little bit gappy. So if it's allowed to kind of go beyond this point where it's still kind of dense and tall, it might eventually reach into the far side of the scores. So back into red, where at this point, it's the kind of the opposite problem. So at this point, it's been kind of left to grow too tall. It's almost becoming a tree line now, and it's a bit over mature. So it's at this point, the only options really left are coppicing again. So as you can see, if you leave it to grow either overmanaged or undermanaged, your management options then drop. So you cannot do hedge laying, you have to do the much more invasive coppicing if you want to bring it back into the dense hedgerow. And then I suppose if you leave it to grow even longer, it'll just become a tree line. At which point really, coppicing would be a bad idea because it's such a valuable habitat in its own right. But if you're going to leave it as a tree line, that's a management choice as well. So, if you let it progress through that cycle, you have to do it with the idea that it's going to become a tree line. You're not going to have a hedgerow anymore, you're going to have a tree line or maybe a linear woodland. And that should be managed as such. So once the trees kind of get to this point, trimming is not an option. You just have to sort of let them grow tall and progress through that. But there's factors to consider like, these trees are eventually going to fall. What's going to happen to the dead wood? Is there any risk associated with that? If they're allowed to grow very tall, is there factors like light? Kind of like, are they going to block light for somebody and cause problems 10 years down the road? So if you're making an active decision to let that hedgerow progress into a tree line, you have to kind of take into account those factors as well. Because what you don't want is to make the choice to let it become a tree line, and then 10 years down the line, someone's like, actually, I'm not happy with that. It's blocking the light to my window. I want to have those trees cut down. So you see, kind of maybe actually having done the coppicing before it gets to score 10 would have been a better choice in the long-term health of the hedge. So this is that was a whistle-stop tour through this diagram. And as you can see, maybe it's a little bit easier to understand now. You can have a read through those slides as well. But we walked through all of these boxes, and the purple arrows and the pink actions are the management actions that are available to you at certain stages. So as you can see, we're trying to keep it in this middle section of the green condition, but it is a cycle. So even though we're keeping it in that green section, it's still moving. It's just moving through this part rather than moving through the undermanaged or the overmanaged sections. And just to wrap up, I wanted to show you some photographs of the hedge laying because Fingal County Council has been really supportive of this rejuvenation action in the last few years and has run several training days together with Hedgerows Ireland with Mark McDowell and Clive Little as well. So hedge laying is a management action to rejuvenate hedgerows and to stimulate new growth from the bottom. So this is a photograph of a hedge layer at our championships in 2024. But the idea is that the stems are cut through at an angle and laid over, allowing new growth to come from the bottom, whilst the old growth is still forming a habitat. It's not removing habitat, it's changing it for a few years, but it's a lot less dramatic than coppicing. And these are some more photographs. This is from Scary's training day over at Scary's Mills. But it's a perpetual process, so like that, you don't do hedge laying once and then forget about it. It'll probably have to come back into that hedge laying cycle, once it gets to the score where it has to be laid over. And the benefits of hedge laying over coppicing and why it's so important not to let them go into that red condition is because it retains more habitat. And traditionally it was used to provide firewood as well. And it's also a bit of fun, I suppose, for community groups to do. Like I go out with Nathan from my local biodiversity group in Naas once a year, and we have great crack having a cup of tea and doing a bit of hedge laying. And once it gets to those amber stages or to the overgrown stages, it really requires the work of professional contractors and even things like chainsaws, which is much more difficult, obviously, for community groups to implement. And so trying to keep it in that green stage is really important. This is a photograph of a cycle like that. So this is what the hedgerow looked like before. This is an example from Selbridge in County Kildare on a farm. So as you can see, the hedgerow is beautiful, it's in flower, but like that, if it's not brought into that hedge laying cycle, eventually it will become a tree line. And in this case, the farmer did not want it to become a tree line. They wanted to keep it as a dense hedgerow and a barrier for their livestock. And so Owen Donnelly, a hedge layer from Wexford, ran a series of training days there. And this is an example of what it looks like straight after the hedge laying. So you see the stems have been cut through at an angle, laid over, and then the following year, there's new growth coming from the bottom. So these are all new shoots coming from where it had been cut. And then this is after 1 season of growth. So 1 season of growth, those new shoots from the bottom have overshot the original stems. You see, it's forming a much denser barrier that for that farmer means that her livestock won't be traipsing through those trees. She won't need to spend as much money on fencing. She'll be able to just have that blocked off there. And then this is 2 years afterwards. So, you know, that new regrowth is now formed essentially a new hedgerow. And the old material is still inside, you know, and is forming kind of another habitat for beetles and insects, etc. And you can see they also left the standing trees in the hedgerow to provide flowers for pollinators and other areas for birds as well. So birds will need higher spots, for example, to perch. So these are just some of the tools that would be used. So you generally, in terms of hand tools, it would be like a bill hook, an axe, a mallet to put in stakes. And then professional contractors will be using chainsaws as well on heavier material. So I'll be around over tea and coffee to have a chat and answer any questions because I'm mindful that it's sandwich time, I think. But yeah, thank you so much to Fingal County Council. And if you have any questions afterwards as well, this is our email here where, you know, we're always happy to help and answer any queries you might have.